Okay. Well, I am a certified health coach, and yeah, going to talk about feeding your kids for optimum physical and mental health today. So the 1992 food pyramid, and then this of course existed before that, but this is a sample of what they were telling us to feed our kids back then, and to feed ourselves. And mostly it was a lot of carbohydrates, of course a nice portion of fruits and vegetables, that's never changed. And then limiting your dairy and your meat and poultry and nuts, and then of course really limiting your fats. And following that food pyramid, you see slowly but surely the rates of obesity in our country rising. Whether it was because or not because of the food pyramid is debatable. It may be because of all the processed foods that then developed based on that food pyramid. But in any case, you know, in 1985, there were very few places that had even a 10 to 14% rate of obesity. And now we have many states, and this is only up through 2016, many states where it's over 35%. So clearly those guidelines were not working and were not correct. So you can also see that in turn with that, there was a huge increase in the number of people in the US diagnosed with diabetes. And at this point, a record number of Americans, more than 40 million, are either diabetic or pre-diabetic, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And they predict that without significant changes, as many as 30% of people with pre-diabetes will go on to have type 2 diabetes. So most of these are type 2 diabetes, or what used to be called adult onset, but of course now they call it type 2 because it's often onsetting in late childhood. So now we have My Plate instead of the food pyramid, which you may have seen. And My Plate has a focus on, of course, half of the plate being covered by fruits and vegetables, which is awesome because it's a much better graphic representation of what we really should be feeding our kids when we set down a plate of food. And then a focus on low-fat dairy, which I personally disagree with, just because there has been, you know, a lot of research, and in particular there was a meta-analysis or an analysis of all the other studies in 2018 that showed that if you have higher concentrations of a biomarker for high-fat dairy, so dairy products in your blood, you have a 29% lower risk of type 2 diabetes. So what tends to happen is you go to the skim milk, but then you end up with more sugar on your cereal, or, you know, those sorts of trade-offs, because if you're not feeling satiated from getting sufficient fat, then you end up going more towards the carbs and the sugar. It also still emphasizes low-fat meats and minimum oils, which, you know, if you've heard of keto diets and things like that, you probably, you know, are wondering about that still continued emphasis. And it's just very hard to turn things around and change that perspective when it comes to government regulations. And this also, the My Plate is now reflected in the school food recommendations and requirements that they do require schools to offer 2 servings of fruits and vegetables per meal, although juice can make up some portion of that for school meals. And just, oh, and I should mention before I say that also you notice on this My Plate, there's a spot for dairy, as in we should always feed our kids milk on the side with their meals.
I was going to tell you, I got some of I walked over the, like, quarantine or whatever, walked with my kids over to get the lunches that the school provides, you know, the grab and go. Yeah. And it was just, I don't drink cow's milk, and my kids are not big, you know, they eat cheese and everything else, but they're not milk drinkers. And we have so much, they give you so much dairy. It's like I was astonished. And a lot of their vegetables are like applesauce, right? And which is good for little kids, but I was surprised.
Yeah. So my previous job actually was advocating for healthier food in schools. And one of the things that we kept trying to deal with and get rid of was these replacements for fruits and vegetables, which, you know, like they used to have frozen juice things that had artificial colors in them that was passing off as a fruit or a vegetable, which was essentially a dessert. Yeah, and it was like a, you know, frozen fruit sorbet, and then of course, yeah, juice and applesauce. And the main reason I think that they do that, obviously because the kids eat it, but also because they have so little money to put together a school meal. It's just very expensive to get all that food for, you know, they have, I think, maybe net $1.30, 40 to pay for the actual food after the cost of running a school food operation for an entire school lunch.
How cheap like some of those items are, and you're like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, well, which means you're getting sort of the lowest quality typically of, you know, meats and vegetables and such. Although there are some schools that do nice farm to table programs and things like that. So anyway, the Harvard Healthy Eating Plate is a little bit different because they don't necessarily say to limit oil. They say healthy oils, limit butter and trans fat, and then they have water as your beverage. So it's not that huge emphasis on dairy. And basically both models recommend limiting red and processed meat and focusing on lean proteins like fish, poultry, and plant-based protein sources like beans and nuts. Okay, so the one piece I did want to mention quite a bit is the whole role of sugar. And you can see from this graph, this is basically a study that looks at the amount of sugar that was available in different countries, because they can track through trade records how much sugar actually enters a country. And what they found was that as the amount of sugar increased in the country, the rate of diabetes increased. And so basically for every 150 calories of sugar consumed per day, there was a 1.1% rise in the rate of diabetes. And this correlation is so strong, you know, obviously normally you want to look at random controls trials where you actually, you know, put a change in and you track what happens with people. But when a correlation is this strong at the population level, you know, there's certain scientific criteria that say you can say this is a causative factor. So clearly sugar is partially to blame, at least in the rise in type 2 diabetes. And then there was another study. Both of these were done by Robert Lustig, who you may have seen if you saw the movie Fed Up. He was part of that. And the other one was he took out the sugar that kids ate for 9 days. They basically took children who were already started to have some issues, at least one chronic metabolic marker that was off, like they had hypertension or high blood pressure, high triglyceride levels, high cholesterol, or a marker of fatty liver was high, or their fasting insulin was high. And they didn't change their calories. They didn't even change their macronutrients, which are fats, carbohydrates, and protein. But what they did was they replaced all of the sugar with starch. And so you can see that sugar itself, even, you know, going beyond bread isn't great for you, but, you know, sugar itself is actually to blame for some things, because in those 9 days, they were able to see every marker of metabolic syndrome decrease.
So did they, when in that study with the starch, did they do complex carbs, or was it still?
No, I think
simple?
They just did simple starches is my recollection.
Wow. So
Yeah.
Even like, wow.
Even white
amazing.
bread is better than sugar. Yeah.
Yeah.
which I guess is good news, since my children, despite my best efforts, nearly live off of white bread.
I know, it is. My kids never have had it unless we go someplace. Like,
had what?
White bread.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, no, it wouldn't be in my house if we're not for my husband buying it. So, anyway, unfortunately, school food requirements have not quite caught up with this. And actually, the latest dietary guidelines recommend that children have no more than 10% of their calories from added sugar. Unfortunately, school food requirements allow the snacks that they sell students in some schools, and even the meals, to have as much as 35% of added sugar by weight. And the good news, though, is that we are now getting added sugar on food labels. The implementation was delayed, but now, as of 2020, the biggest companies had to add a line for added sugar on the nutrition facts labels. And by 2021, the smallest companies will have to add that label as well. But when, you know, part of this talk is talking about protecting your immune system, and sugar is particularly detrimental for your immune system because it causes inflammation, and the amount of sugar in one soda depresses your immune system by 50% for 4 to 5 hours. So what can you do instead if your children like sweet things? Here are some alternatives to sugar. You probably are familiar with these first 4: aspartame, aspartame, potassium, saccharin, and sucralose, because these are present in a lot of diet sodas and some diet yogurts and possibly ice creams, things like that. And of course in the packets you find on tables. These are the worst 4. All carry risks both for cancer and some for disrupting your gut microbiome and killing off good bacteria. So those are the ones to avoid. The safer choices are stevia, which a lot of people are used to at this point. I'm not fond of it because of the bitter aftertaste, but it is a healthy, safe alternative. Monk fruit extract, which is a newer one. It's not sold by itself all that much. Often you see it mixed in with a sugar alcohol like erythritol. But if you do buy it by itself, you can get drops and you can get powder. It's quite expensive though. My favorites are, actually my favorite is xylitol. It's a sugar alcohol. It is made from either corn or from the bark of birch trees, and it can replace sugar 1-to-1. It looks like sugar. It has the same makeup in terms of, if you put it into a recipe, it works like sugar. It is fatal to dogs, so some people don't choose that because they have dogs at home. And for some people it has a laxative effect, especially if you have a lot of it. So, but it does replace sugar very well in recipes. It has no aftertaste. It tastes exactly like sugar. Another option is erythritol for people who don't do well with xylitol or who have dogs and they don't want to risk their dog eating something. Again, that, you know, too much of it can cause nausea. It's not exactly a 1-to-1 ratio with sugar. It's 3/4 cup sugar to 1 cup erythritol. But if you buy like the Lakanto monk fruit sweeteners, it's typically erythritol and monk fruit to make it equally sweet as sugar. And then mannitol and sorbitol, you can now see those in packages like at natural grocers, for example. And again, you want to keep the amounts small. So if you're making something, you know, recipe, I'll typically say take a regular muffin recipe and I'll cut the sugar to 3/4. So at that point, you're not having all that much in any given individual item. So make sure that was just this next one. Okay, so.
Oh.
Yep.
Have you ever used coconut sugar?
Yeah, so coconut sugar is a lower glycemic option. Honey is another option that's natural, and maple syrup, things like that. Like on a paleo diet, for example, some of those things are considered acceptable. Coconut sugar is good because it is lower glycemic, and I've used it, so it's definitely a better option.
Yeah, and I like the way it tastes and stuff too. It's not like super, you know, some of those artificial ones are so sweet.
Right, yeah, that's why I like the sugar alcohol ones, because they're not excessively sweet. They taste more or less like sugar.
Okay.
But we basically, the reason you can eat those and not have the same effects is our bodies just don't digest them, which is why some of them have a laxative effect, because the bacteria in our guts do digest them and then they create gases, and basically that's why you have the issues for some people with digesting them, depending on the makeup of the gut microbiome. Okay, so let's talk next a little bit about organics. So there is, I have definitely seen going around in the alternative health circles, this graph where they look at the amount of glyphosate that it was applied to corn and soy in the US against the rise in type 2 diabetes in the US. And you see the graphs are very similar, including that little dip that kind of runs between like 98 and 2002. And so this is also a potential additional factor, is that glyphosate may be, have some role in type 2 diabetes. It definitely has a role in disrupting the gut microbiome, and that can have a role in type 2 diabetes. So that's another potential factor that's at play, which is why, for me, eating organic is important. But even more important than that, for example, with dairy and meat and eggs, is pasture raised or pastured, because to get a certification for organic, it's very expensive and a lot of small farmers can't do it. But the important thing is, are these animals being raised on pasture? Because the difference in the amount of omega-3 fatty acids and nutrients in the meat and in the dairy it's going to be much higher if they're raised on pasture or grass-fed, grass-finished. So sometimes you'll see the label grass-fed, but in fact, it's grass-fed up until the last month when they stick them on a feedlot and they feed them corn, which cows are not meant to eat and get very sick on. And so really knowing your food source and trying to find grass-fed is ideal. And then, you know, if you can't find that, then raised without antibiotics is a better choice. Obviously, organic is a good choice if you can find that, and hormone-free. Organic does mean they have to have the animals on pasture a certain portion of the year.
When do they have, where do you buy pasture-raised meat here?
So I order my meat from Chiricahua Pasture Raised Meats. It's at cprmeats.com, I think. And they deliver to Tucson once every 5 or 6 weeks. I also just get organic chicken at Costco. And then at Natural Grocers, you can find pastured meats. All of the meats they sell there, they claim to be pastured. So
aren't they all, they're all organic, right, too?
Yeah, all their I don't know that everything they sell is, but all of their produce is organic, yes. So I like Natural Grocers because Whole Foods has numbers that show the level of, you know, how, you know, if it's a 1, it's sort of, yes, there's no hormones given. If it's a 4, it's raised on pasture and it's organic and it's everything. So you'll see if in their, you know, Whole Foods, their meat counter, very few items, especially things like pork, are going to hit that 4. So that's why I like choosing Natural Grocers, because they have just pastured meats.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of produce, sometimes it is hard to get organic produce, especially those fun things that come in the summer, like the peaches and the nectarines and the cherries. But if you look at these lists that the Environmental Working Group puts out each year of the Dirty Dozen and then the Clean 15, and I'm looking now and realize that is that actually a dozen? That doesn't seem like a dozen. Maybe it is, yeah, 7 and 12. So these are the crops that have the most pesticide residues on them, and they measure it each year. And so sometimes you'll see something that's on the Dirty Dozen list one year and it moves to the Clean 15, because as soon as your crop gets targeted, then the farmers clean up their act and they start reducing the pesticides they're using. So these are the ones that, at least this year, and you can look that up from the Environmental Working Group, that are the ones you most want to get organic. And then the Clean 15 are the ones where you can most afford to just get regular if you want to, you know, reduce costs. So, you know, it's notable, like sweet corn used to be big because a lot of the corn, the vast majority of corn in the US is covered with glyphosate, which is the same as Roundup, which I didn't mention when I was on the other slide. Anyway, so, and I've seen things like eggplants are typically a high pesticide one. And so it's nice to see these on the Clean 15 list this year. So in terms of fats, the composition of the fats that you eat is actually very important, and something that most people are getting more omega-6 fatty acids, which are the more pro-inflammatory fats. And that's typically coming from your processed foods, your vegetable oils, your processed seed oils. So if you are eating things like canola oil or safflower oil, you definitely want to get the cold pressed organic. But ideally, you'll try and focus more on the omega-3 fatty acids and the omega-9s. And so you'll get a lot of omega-3s from things that most children don't like sardines and anchovies and mackerel and salmon and other seafood, although some kids like sushi. So salmon's a really good choice there, because tuna has mercury in it. So you definitely want to stay away from that unless it's a mercury-safe tuna choice. And then flax, chia, and hemp seeds are good sources of omega-3s. Walnuts, seaweed, those seaweed snacks, those are good. And then pasture-raised eggs. And then omega-9s come from extra virgin olive oil, although, you know, it's not a good cooking oil unless you're really just doing a real quick stir fry of something, because it has a pretty low smoke point. Avocado oil is a good choice for cooking because it's got a high smoke point, and once an oil starts smoking, it's essentially toxic, so you don't want to hit the smoke point. And then almonds and cashews are also good sources of omega-9s. And then in terms of sources of saturated fat, and also medium chain triglycerides, which are an instant energy source, coconut oil. Refined has a higher smoke point, so that's the one that would already come liquid, and that's a better one for cooking than the virgin coconut oil that has a pretty low smoke point. And then you may see MCT oil being sold in stores. That's like sort of instant energy. It helps people go into ketosis if they're doing a ketogenic diet, if you've heard of that. So that's another option for those. And then in terms of saturated fats, again, the pasturates, meat and dairy, eggs, etc. And then some people like to cook with those. Beef tallow would be the highest smoke point there. So one of the issues for kids eating today is typically that they are not getting anywhere near enough fiber. So the recommended daily allowance for fiber runs based on age between 25 and 38 grams a day. And only about 5% of Americans, kids and adults, get the recommended amount of fiber. And fiber is super important for your gut health, for your gut microbiome, and then as a consequence, because there is that gut-brain axis, for your mental health. So a lot of kids who have digestive problems may also have mental problems, be it anxiety or depression or ADHD or autism spectrum disorder. So it's really important to make sure your kids get enough fiber. And the biggest powerhouses of fiber are going to be your beans, peas, and lentils, which for some kids are hard to get in and not their favorites, but most kids like hummus if you can do that. Whole grains is, of course, another good source of fiber. And of course, we all know about whole wheat bread, but going beyond that, looking at brown, black, or wild rice are good options. Steel cut or slow cooking oatmeal is a great option. Quinoa, bulgur, millet, and kamut if you want to get fancy. And then, of course, fruits and vegetables are great sources of fiber. And if you're doing gluten-free, you've got a good number of grain-free flours that work well, like almond flour, cassava flour, coconut, and chickpea flour. And then there's some grain-based gluten-free flours that are also good, like millet and sweet sorghum. I particularly like those first two for baking. If you want to replace basic baking flour and have it taste pretty similar to almost a white flour, basically. And then oat flour, if it's marked gluten-free, is also a good option. And I would say the worst option is brown rice flour, just because if you are gluten-free, typically you or your child are eating a lot of rice already, and rice does have arsenic in it, so the less rice flour you're using in other types of things like homemade baked goods, the better. So I know this is a piece you're interested in, so dealing with picky eaters. I understand what it is to have picky eaters because I have 2 kids of my own, and they almost all are picky around vegetables. That's usually the hard part, although some kids are picky around protein as well. So from the perspective that it's usually vegetables that we're having trouble introducing, the best way to try and introduce new foods to a picky eater is to do it outside of mealtime, because that keeps mealtime as a relaxed, pleasant time, good family time, and not a time where you're forcing your food on your child and creating stress. So basically, maybe it's at 5 p.m. or, it's good to especially introduce vegetables right at that time when kids are really hungry, and that's usually a time they're really hungry. So what you can do is choose maybe 3 or 4 vegetables, or you can just ask your child, which vegetable, do you find least repulsive, or, which one would you like to try? And they get to choose which one they want to try next. And maybe the first thing they do is not taking a bite and putting it in their mouth. Maybe it's just smelling it, and they may need to smell it several times. Then maybe they just put their tongue on it, and maybe they take a lick. And then eventually the goal is to get them to take one little bite. And so what you want to do is introduce that same food every day with just one small bite. So for example, I did with my son, it was red peppers. And just each day he took one small bite. And really by the end of 3 or 4 days, he's like, I like it well enough. I don't love it, but I can eat it. And sure enough, after that, we could introduce it in salads. But you may have to do 10 to 15 tries for a child to actually like and feel comfortable with a new food, because it's almost just like a new friend. They're kind of iffy around it at first until they've seen it enough. And rather than putting it in their mouth and then saying, do you like it or not? What's much better is to ask them things about it, like, okay, how does that taste? Does it taste salty? Does it taste sweet, sour, bitter, green? What about the texture? Is it soft? Is it crunchy? Is it mushy? Is it hard? And getting them to think about foods in other terms than just I like it or I don't like it. Because when you attach those labels of liking it or don't like it to it, it's very easy to just, okay, this is a food I don't like, I'm never going to consider it again, versus, oh, this is a food that has certain qualities. Those qualities are similar to things that I like. And it helps kids to think in a different way about the food. So the other thing is, whatever things that they will eat, it's much better to introduce them at times that they're really hungry. So if we're coming home from school starving, that's the time you lay out the raw vegetable tray, because they're much more likely to just grab it and eat it, even if it's not their choice, even if they'd much rather go for that bagel after school. If you've got raw vegetables sitting there with some dipping sauce, they're going to grab that sooner than go to the trouble of preparing something on their own. And then another important concept with regard to picky eating is just understanding the separation of powers in eating. And it is that parents' responsibility is to offer healthy food on a regular basis, and children's responsibility is to either eat it or not eat it. And as long as you keep that separate, typically children will grow up and ultimately develop healthy eating habits. But when you start to push food on children and pressure them into eating, that's when you start to see problems developing. And then, of course, if you are dealing with a picky eater, one of the best sort of insurance policies against that is just to give your kid a good quality multivitamin in order to make sure that they get the proper nutrients and develop properly in the meantime. In terms of body image, the way that you can make sure that your child develops a healthy body image is to, first of all, model comfort with your own body. So not criticizing or talking about the parts of your body you don't like in front of your child. And then also just modeling good nutrition and a positive relationship with food, with, including occasional treats. So you don't have to be, super doctrinaire about never eating anything sweet or whatever. It's rather like, oh, okay, this is a treat. Yes, we don't necessarily have ice cream after every meal, but we can go out and get an ice cream cone sometimes. And then also, if you have a child who is particularly concerned about their body, having both mom and dad give positive feedback, ideally, or mom and mom or dad and dad, whatever the family arrangement is, having both parents give positive feedback to their child about their appearance. And then also getting your children involved with sports is really important for developing a good body image. And then concentrating on health, not weight. So if you do have a child who's overweight, often you have just one child who's overweight and not necessarily everyone in the family. But if you want to see that child, get a healthier diet, the diet changes should be for the whole family, not the rest of the family. And I know that sometimes people feel like they're depriving the other kids who don't need to worry about their weight of a treat, but that's not really what's happening. You really want to make those diet changes for the whole family, because the treats and the unhealthy stuff are not everyday things, and they shouldn't be for kids who aren't worrying about their weight or kids who are worrying about their weight. And then, of course, you want to limit screen time, because that's really, especially if there's commercials, that is a source of temptation. And also just watching TV often goes hand in hand with eating. And so limiting screen time can help with that. And then also just making sure kids get enough sleep, because lack of sleep is also a factor in weight gain. Okay, so I kind of grouped all of the issues around ADHD, autism, and other behavioral or health issues together in terms of items that may cause a negative impact in those areas. So in particular with food additives and ADHD, food dyes have been implicated in causing behaviors that resemble ADHD. So for example, about 90% of child-oriented candies, fruit-flavored snacks, and drink mixes are colored with dyes. And the majority of the foods by the major companies like Kraft, Pepsi, and General Mills contain food dyes, even though in Europe they don't, where they're banned. And since 2004, there's been 3 meta-analyses of the literature on these, including more than 30 double-blind studies. They concluded that excluding food dyes from the diet has beneficial effects on the symptoms of ADHD for some children. So there's a subset of children who are basically sensitive to food dyes, and in particular when there's a lot of them mixed together. And then sodium benzoate is often in the same products, and also can, combined with food dyes, can cause problems like hyperactivity. And you'll often find it in like carbonated drinks, salad dressings, and condiments. Sugar is another issue. Several studies suggest that some kids who have ADHD are turned on by a lot of sugar, and just that the children can become more hyperactive the more sugar they had. Of course, this is somewhat controversial, but there was a study from Yale University that showed that high sugar diets increased inattention in some kids. So again, I think the issue is that not every child necessarily reacts to these things like food dyes and sugar, but there are a subset of kids who do. So balancing blood sugar is really important, and part of balancing blood sugar is making sure that your child's eating a balanced diet. So again, whole grains are important, the whole wheat bread or whole grain breads rather than the white breads, but along with something else, because even a whole grain bread actually has the same, what's the glycemic index, or the amount of rise in your blood sugar over a certain period of time. Same glycemic index as white bread. So what you really want to make sure of is that you're eating healthy fats and protein along with sources of grains and carbohydrates. So if you think about like a healthy balanced breakfast, it's going to have protein and healthy fats. It's not going to be the bagel or the Pop-Tart or just a bowl of cereal with skim milk. If you have a bowl of cereal, obviously you want the lowest sugar one you can get, and then you want to add ideally whole milk, because then you're getting some fat in there and some protein. So another thing that's come up in the literature is that for children with autism spectrum disorder, ketogenic diets, which were originally developed for epilepsy to help children who decrease epileptic seizures, but that they're actually effective in reducing the symptoms of ASD. And so basically the ketogenic diet is a diet where you're eating the vast majority of your calories from fat, that's about 70%, and 25% from protein, and only 5% from what they call net carbohydrates, which is when you take the carbohydrates and you subtract out the fiber. But which is also a handy measure for thinking about what is a healthy, say, cereal, what is a healthy granola bar. Look at not just how much sugar is in there, but how much fiber is in there. So maybe one bar has 10 grams of sugar, but it's also got 5 grams of fiber. You can subtract the sugar off of the fiber and get your net, which basically tells you how quickly is that sugar going to hit the bloodstream. And the more fiber you have, the slower it's going to hit the bloodstream. So that's a good way to pick out a better choice of a bar or of a cereal. Another factor in ADHD in particular can be excess copper in the diet, and sometimes that's coming from your water in your pipes, copper piping. And that can interfere with zinc, which then can cause problems and symptoms of ADHD. So sometimes reducing that copper is an issue. And then another issue for children with any of these issues is that there may be food intolerances. And the best way to figure out if your child has a food intolerance is to do an elimination diet. And typically you want to do 3 weeks off of the food at least, and then you test the food by itself for a couple times, and then wait up to a week to see if you have a reaction. And the two most common problem foods with food intolerances are gluten and dairy. And so if you have a child who's pretty difficult eater, those would be the two that I would say would be most important to try and target in an elimination diet. And there's some evidence that from clinical studies that children with ADHD and autism spectrum disorder have food intolerances that are impacting their symptoms. And when I say food intolerance, this is not the same as an allergy, right? This is not an IgE reaction where you're having some sort of, hives and anaphylaxis and that sort of thing. This is much different. It's what's called an IgG reaction, and it's a slower reaction and may manifest more in, say, gut symptoms, or maybe some skin problems that come on later, but not necessarily, and in behavioral problems, not the same way an allergy would right away after you eat it.
Lindsey,
if you are considering an elimination diet and you want to go beyond gluten and dairy because that doesn't seem to be doing the job, the most common allergens are soy, corn, eggs, nightshades, nuts and seeds, beans and legumes, grains, and chocolate and coffee. And each of those items has a particular quality that can cause your gut to become more permeable and let items escape. And then often the proteins in those foods are complex, and then when they hit your body start to cause problems. So those would be the ones, although I imagine an elimination diet of that type with a child would be very difficult. If you feel like your child only maybe perhaps has just, say, a gluten or a dairy allergy, you can also do food allergy testing. It's not super reliable, especially if you have a child with a very leaky gut. And that a leaky gut, by the way, is not the same as diarrhea. A leaky gut implies that things are escaping out of the intestinal walls that are not quite digested, and that the intestinal walls are not held together very strongly. And generally, a child who's having behavioral problems, who's having skin reactions, mental health issues, probably has a leaky gut. So often if you go and do a food allergy test, an IgG type test, you'll find that they're going to get a whole list of foods that they're allergic to. And if you get that, then often that's not a sign that they're actually, or intolerant to, I shouldn't say allergic, intolerant to. That doesn't mean that they're actually intolerant to all those foods. It just means that they have a leaky gut. And once it's sealed up, they may be able to digest those foods again. Other issues for children with ADHD, ASD, or other health or behavioral issues, of course, sleep is a big one. I have a child with ADHD, and when he was diagnosed, part of the problems that the teachers were talking about was the fact that he was lying on his desk asleep every day. And of course, we discovered that he'd been sneaking his cell phone into his bedroom every night. So that's one of the most important things, is getting those cell phones out of the bedroom if your child has one. And making sure they're getting, well, for children, basically at least 8 hours, but ideally 9 to 11 hours of sleep a night. So let's talk a little bit about the traditional ways of treating ADHD in particular. Mostly we're looking at medications, typically stimulant medications, and there are real risks with those medications. So one big factor, of course, is just that you get that rebound effect every evening as the medication wears off, and some kids then become more, their behavior gets worse. And also it can cause fatigue, it can cause depression, suicidal feelings, and then as they're taking it off for good, you can also have withdrawal that can last 3 to 10 days. With stimulant medications, you can have all sorts of side effects, including insomnia, seizures, agitation, irritability, nervousness, confusion, disorientation, and there's basically 25 more that I could list. So basically just heaps of things, including, abnormal liver function, bleeding problems, permanent tics. So there are all sorts of risks with those medications. So finding natural ways to deal with these problems is really important, in particular ADHD. So let's look at some of the supplements that can be helpful for children with ADHD. So first of all, the B vitamins are often deficient, and so a good B complex is a good choice because B vitamins help with the formation of serotonin, which is especially attributable to vitamin B6. Fish oil is also a good supplement because of the omega-3 fatty acids, and in particular you want to look for one that is higher in EPA than DHA for children. So they have found that for children in particular, they did a study on children 8 to 12 years old, that it may improve their mental skills. And it's something that I've always supplemented with once my child was able to start taking pills. It's also important that children with ADHD have zinc, calcium, and magnesium. These are the calming minerals and are often deficient in children with ADHD. So a multi-mineral complex or individual supplements. A multi-mineral would be safe to try. If you're going to supplement with these, you want to test and see what the levels are, because you don't want to get too much, in particular zinc. So you can get blood tests and then track and figure out what a good dosage is for your child. Multivitamins, again, are important. A good quality multivitamin, you'll look for one that has folate or methylated folate. It's usually L4 methylfolate, L5 methylfolate, something like that, or not just folic acid, because some kids have problems turning folic acid into a usable form of folate. Probiotics are also a really good choice because for ADHD and ASD, they're often connected to digestive issues like constipation, diarrhea, and a leaky gut. And so a daily good quality probiotic may help with those issues. Although often if children have serious gut issues, they do need to get a diagnosis of what's going on in their gut, and perhaps you need to kill off an overgrowth of pathogenic bacteria, an overgrowth of bacteria in general in the small intestine, or a correction to some type of dysbiosis like an overgrowth of fungus. Another supplement for ADHD is GABA, which is an amino acid that is calming, but you definitely want to ask your doctor before using that because it can interact in particular with some of these medications that children are on. And then another mineral that is particularly implicated in ADHD is lithium, and it is normally in low doses in the water supply, but if you are in a place that doesn't have a lot of lithium, or if you're filtering your water and you're filtering it out, your child may not be getting enough, and some children are genetically susceptible to needing that lithium. And what they're finding is as they test the hair of children, the levels of lithium are decreasing. So researchers have found that a very low dose of lithium, not the kind that would be normally used in mental health, but a very low dose, like ranging from 250 micrograms for, say, a 4-year-old to 10 milligrams for an adult, may be helpful in calming some of those hyperactive, irritable, and aggressive behaviors in children with ADHD. Now for autism, the supplements are quite similar actually. Multivitamins again with folate rather than folic acid. Magnesium, that's a very common deficiency. And again, you know, it's good to get the levels checked and then figure out what a good maintenance dose is. Vitamin B6 or B complex that includes vitamin B6 is important. Zinc is another common deficiency, and vitamin D3 and iron. Often children with autism are low in iron because they're picky eaters. So getting all those levels checked and then figuring out what a good maintenance dose is by checking it periodically and then getting settled on that is the ideal scenario for supplementing with those particular vitamins and minerals. Then omega-3 fatty acids also very important, very critical for brain function and anti-inflammatory. And it is one of the most common complementary or alternative things used for children with ASD. L-carnitine is another supplement. It's an amino acid that has been shown to improve supplements of autism. And basically the study that was done on it showed that it significantly improved autism severity, but they were still recommending subsequent studies. Another potential intervention is using digestive enzymes, and this is just to help children digest their food better. And if you have a child who seems to have a leaky gut, that's a good choice. And it can help then with the absorption of the vitamins and the minerals. And then also, again, as I said, the probiotics. And then I did want to mention that there was a researcher at Arizona State University, Dr. James Adams, and I interviewed him on my podcast. My podcast is called The Perfect Stool, Understanding and Healing the Gut Microbiome. And I interviewed him on episode 12. And he is doing research using purified fecal transplants. So this is actually stool material that comes from a healthy donor and is purified to the point where children can even take it orally. So basically just the bacteria is pulled out of it, and seeing some amazing changes. And in particular, what happened was they did a 10-week intervention where the children were given the original fecal transplant, and then they were given either the oral or the other route, fecal transplant over a period of 10 weeks. And then they followed up with the people 2 years later because they found parents were saying, my child started to get better, but he just started getting better and better. Like his development just took off after that point. And in particular, this is with children who have gastrointestinal issues in conjunction with autism, because those are the children that seem to be most amenable to this kind of intervention. So I definitely encourage you to look at he has something called the Autism Nutrition Research Center, and they also sell through there some supplements specifically for autism spectrum disorder, and you can look for those at the Autism Nutrition Research Center. In terms of recommended foods that have some of the nutrients in particular that we just mentioned, bone broth and organic turkey, because of tryptophan, which is sort of calming. Amino acid, fermented foods are good because, again, that helps the gut. Wild-caught fish for the high omega-3s, and just in general, unprocessed foods, getting rid of a lot of those omega-6 fatty acids that are in these processed seed oils and most processed foods, and then all of those other ingredients we don't want. And I think you could equally say that these would be good choices for ADHD. Then I wanted to talk a little bit too about protecting your immune system. So for adults, there are 5 key health behaviors. Hopefully these don't apply to most children, like not smoking and moderate alcohol, but as they get older, of course, it is important to tell your children not to drink, not to smoke, because children whose parents say, this is my expectation for you, are less likely to do those things. So even if it feels silly to tell your 8-year-old, I expect you not to smoke, Vaping is very common, middle and high school. You do need to say it. I expect you not to smoke. I expect you not to vape. This is why it's unhealthy, and to talk to your kids about those things. But yeah, in terms of the 5 key health behaviors that essentially protect your health and protect your immune system, only 6.8% of people in Arizona do all 5 of these, and only, I think, 6.2% nationally. So yes, including meeting the daily aerobic physical activity requirement or recommendation, which is either 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity physical activity or 75 minutes per week of vigorous intensity activity. And maintaining a normal body mass index, which is obtained by dividing your weight by your height. You'll have to look that up. I'm sure there's calculators online. And then sleeping at least 7 hours a day for adults, 9 to 10 for children, school-age children. And then also, this isn't included in that general 5 key health behaviors, but having healthy gut function is also really important for protecting your immunity, because your gut is so connected with your brain and your immune system. In fact, 80% of your immune system resides in the gut. So what does a healthy gut function look like? It is, for adults and children, that you're having at least 1 bowel movement a day, but no more than 3. It's well formed, as in it's not too soft. It's easily passed. It's not rabbit pellets, and it comes out with a clean wipe. So if you're familiar with the Bristol stool scale or the Bristol stool chart, you can look that up. A 3 or 4 on the Bristol stool chart is considered normal stool. And it's okay if occasionally you have something that's off that, but if you're having, say, diarrhea once a week, or regularly very soft and messy stool, or regularly very rabbit pellet hard stool, that is not a normal bowel function. So likely, if that's the case, you probably need more diet, more fiber in your diet. You may need to look at an elimination diet to see if there's food intolerances. You may need to look at digestive enzymes, or you may need to get some functional medicine testing to see what's going on with your gut in terms of potential bacterial or fungal overgrowth or pathogenic bacteria, or possibly parasites and things like that. Then in terms of protecting your immune system, thinking right now in terms of COVID, the Institute for Functional Medicine recommended certain supplements and vitamins and minerals for protecting your immune system. And sort of the basics for immunity in terms of vitamins and minerals are vitamins D, A, and C. D is like your master hormone. It is super important to have optimal levels of vitamin D, which is 60 to 80. Whereas 30 is considered in traditional medicine an acceptable level. Optimal level is what you want to shoot for, which is what optimal functional level. And we're talking about functional medicine, which is looking at the root cause and prevention, as opposed to waiting until something severe happens. So making sure you get your D tested yearly, and sun, unfortunately, is not usually enough for most of us, because we all wear sunscreen and we block it, and then we shower daily. And what you really need to do is have 15 to 30 minutes sun exposure, so you're not burning, and without sunscreen, and then you need to not wash your body for 48 hours to get enough vitamin D. So most people do need to supplement with vitamin D. And vitamin C, you can supplement with that, but you don't want to do more than 500 milligrams at a time. So if you want to divide the doses, I think they recommend 2 grams a day. So basically 4 doses of 500 milligrams, just to keep your C levels up in case of an infection. And then zinc is also another important nutrient that, you can supplement at lower levels, like say 15 milligrams a day. You don't want to take a really large supplement without getting your zinc tested, because you can get too much zinc. And then they also list all these other supplements that are immune supportive and antiviral: resveratrol, quercetin, curcumin, EGCG, which is in green tea, so better just to get it through the green tea, N-acetylcysteine, which is helps promote the production of glutathione in your body, which is your master antioxidant, which is killing off all of those free radicals, melatonin, which people often use to help sleep, elderberry, and PEA. So these are the supplements that they recommend. I would say it would be a little bit overboard perhaps to start taking those right now, but if you were infected with coronavirus, I would jump on all those supplements. And if you go to the webpage for the Institute for Functional Medicine and look up COVID, they will have a list of these and what the potential risks are, what the recommended dosages are, etc. And if you are having serious issues, or you have a child with ADHD or ASD and you really want to dig a little bit deeper into their health and how you can improve it and maximize it, you probably want to look at talking to somebody who practices functional medicine. So there are functional medicine MDs, naturopaths, you pretty much practice functional medicine. Some chiropractors do, some nutritionists do. You might see some PharmDs out there who are practicing it. And then I consider myself within the field of functional medicine as a health coach. In particular, I coach adults or can help families via the parents. I don't work directly with children, at least not small children. But I typically coach around weight loss without dieting, gut health, and reversing autoimmune disease. And I also have my podcast, The Perfect Stool, Understanding and Healing the Gut Microbiome, which you can find on, iTunes or Apple Podcasts, I should say, or any of the podcast apps. And if you'd like to set up a free 1-hour discovery session with me, I am always available for that. You can do that from my website, highdeserthealthcoaching.com, or you can email me, lindsey@highdeserthealthcoaching.com, and set that up, and we can talk about what's going on with your health and what health coaching looks like. So I would love to talk to any of you. Thank you.